So as I started to say, right, that there was a big decision out of the Supreme Court um, in the early hours of the morning last night, at least in where the court is located. And yeah, I'll start with the idea that the order prevents, right, the administration from flying people that it alleges are enemy aliens under the 1798 Enemy Aliens Act out of the country into deportation in El Salvador or elsewhere. And it is an emergency order. There's no opinion. We do know that there were two dissents, so presumably it was a 7-2 emergency order. The full court appears to have weighed in on this, and what that means, among other things, we'll get into this, but all three of the Trump appointed justices agreed with this motion. The only two dissenters, Samuel Alito and Clarence Thomas, are from before, right before Trump appointed and he went to the court. And it's an interesting, right, indication. It's a not a unanimous decision, but it's a very clear and strong majority of the court telling Trump to stop it, right? And so let me just say for a moment what I think is going on here, and then we'll get into the details. But I think in the first instance, the position of the administration has been Congress gave the president this power, gave it to him in 1798. It's only been used three times, right? The War of 1812, World War I, World War II. It's not like it's a power that is used a lot and certainly hasn't been used in a condition in which there isn't a declared war. But having said that, Congress gave the president this power, and so the president gets to exercise it, and he gets to determine, right? This is part of the unified executive interpretation. He has the power to determine who this act applies to. And the consequence has been, we've seen it in particular in the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, right, that even if the determination was made by mistake, right, and the administration has admitted, at least in that one case, it was made by mistake. By the way, the journalists and others who have investigated the 350 odd people who've been deported from the country so far say that roughly 75% of them are not members of the Trinidad de Agua gang or cartel, and in particular that the 75% of them who've been deported have no criminal records whatsoever, right? And so the idea that they're only going after people who are gangs, that this gang is in fact an agent of the Venezuelan government, that it's part of an effort to invade the United States, none of this, I think, would hold up if it got to court, right? But the administration is claiming that it gets to act in a judicial capacity in enforcing this law. It gets to be judge and jury and not just executor of the law. And so, in this sense, right, the meaning of autocracy, why I say that at this point the court is resisting autocracy, is because the executive, the president, Trump and his administration are claiming that they get to determine what this law means, who it applies to, and how it's going to be interpreted. They are judge, jury, and executor. And then, by the way, they also say, well, once the person is out of the United States jurisdiction, then there's nothing that can be done, right? So, yes, Abrego Garcia was mistakenly deported to a prison where the head of the judicial panel that investigated it in El Salvador said that people only leave this prison in coffins, right? It's one of the most notoriously awful prisons in the world today. Once he's there, there's nothing we can do about it. American law no longer reaches him. It's game over, right? And the Supreme Court said last night, we're not going to let you do this again, right? We want him brought back, right? The court has been very clear about that. He needs to have his due process rights under the Constitution, and therefore you need to facilitate his return. We'll get into this, but in particular, if you're going to resist returning the people you deport to another country's prison back to the US in order to give them the rights that they are due, we're going to stop you from doing this again. And so I think the court is essentially saying, no, it's game on. We are going to rise to the challenge. And so I do think that actually what happened last night is extraordinarily important in recognizing that the Supreme Court is now clearly stating we no longer trust this administration to execute the law faithfully, to recognize the constraints the judiciary imposes on it. And I think the last week has been extremely important in revealing that this administration is simply going to disregard at least the decisions from courts inferior to the Supreme Court that it does not like, right? It's been ordered to allow the members of the Associated Press to return to the White House press corps, right? The pool that gets to cover the president, and it's refused to, right? It has been told by a judge that it has to actually report on what it's doing to get Abrego Garcia back. It's refused to. And so the Supreme Court is, I think, rising to the challenge, at least in this preliminary decision, and saying if this is the way this administration is going to play, we need to push back. We need to make sure that we are not coming in too late to actually provide the kind of protection of the rule of law and rights that our Constitution affords to every resident in our country, not just to citizens. And so I have on the board, right, a couple of images, and this is to frame the conversation for today. On the one hand, right, I've got this image I like of the Congress burning in the same way, of course, that the Reichstag fire consumed the German parliament as Hitler rose to power and led to him to declare emergency powers, right? And my point, and I believe the point of the artist, is not literally that Congress is burned, but that it might as well have for the amount of resistance that it's putting up to Donald Trump. It is completely supine, and that is because it's in control of the same party that the president belongs to, and because it appears that in 2025, loyalty to the party is more important than loyalty to the Constitution. And so we do not have a congressional check, and there could be many congressional checks on the president. Obviously, the most forceful check on the president that the Constitution specifies is impeachment. But it doesn't have to get to that level right away. The Congress has the power of the purse. It could start taking money away from the things the president cares about in order to generate leverage. Not only is it not doing that, it's doing exactly the opposite. It is allowing the president to nominate and have confirmed people who are completely supine. And maybe we'll have a little bit of time to talk about what Kash Patel is doing with the FBI, but I think they're things we should be extremely alarmed about. And frankly, that Congress has authorized the president to do. But having said that, I also have a second image here, right? And this is an image of the derelict Supreme Court, of the Supreme Court as a haunted house, as a place where old ideas bounce around and people dare not go, right? And up until last night, I would say that this is probably the majority view of the Supreme Court. This is the Supreme Court that overturned Roe v. Wade, which roughly 3/4 of Americans, 2/3 of Americans disagree with that decision. This is the Supreme Court that gave the President of the United States, now Donald Trump, full immunity from criminal prosecution even after he's out of office for things related to the core and perhaps the peripheral functions of his office. Again, a very unpopular decision, but a decision that seems to speak to the idea that the majority of the justices on the Supreme Court believe that they have unilateral authority over the Constitution. It's not the people's Constitution. And now that same court is trying to restrict the president who won the popular and the electoral college vote and who has an iron grasp on his party, which controls both houses of Congress. And my suggestion to you in these images and in what I will say going forward is that it's extraordinarily important that the Supreme Court rose to the fight, right? It is an indication that the justices, including the three justices that Trump appointed, recognize the threat of the consolidation of autocratic power, right? Where autocracy means one branch of government takes to itself the authority and role of the other branches of government. That Donald Trump does not want to be checked or balanced is clear, that he is taking steps to override the limits and disregard the potential checks and balances on his authority is now increasingly clear. The Supreme Court is rising to that fight. But I think it's also clear, right? We don't know ultimately, right? This was a temporary stay. Just don't put those people out of the country right now. We don't know what the ultimate decisions the Supreme Court will issue. The cases will have to get to the Supreme Court. But I want to say, even if the Supreme Court ultimately concludes that this administration is in contempt of court or that lower courts are appropriate in holding this administration in contempt of court, the Supreme Court by itself, the federal judiciary by itself, lacks the capacity, not the authority, but the capacity, the governance capacity to enforce its decisions. If they hold someone in criminal contempt, the president can pardon him. But even if he doesn't pardon the people who are held in criminal contempt, the federal marshals who would have to enforce that decision work for the attorney general. And I think there's very little chance that Pam Bondi is going to use them to enforce judgments against this administration, right? And so I then have one more little set of images on the board here. And right, I've got the seal of Harvard, Veritas, truth, right? And the president of Harvard, Alan Garber. And as we know, perhaps there was a mistake. The administration sent a letter to Harvard on Friday, a week ago, that was so extreme that the president and the trustees of Harvard, the corporation, pushed back and said, no way, we're not going to try to work things out with this administration. We're not going to take Columbia's path. By the way, I think it's increasingly clear you give Donald Trump what he wants, and rather than saying, thank you, now go about your business, he says, I'll take some more. Right? This is the autocrat's playbook again. And so Harvard is also joining the fight. And Harvard is not a branch of our government, right? Despite its pretenses to the contrary sometimes. It is a civil society institution. It's like our law firms. It's like our Associated Press. And my claim to you is, in a world in which Congress is not for the next 2 years going to be a meaningful check on Donald Trump, the Supreme Court has cut its own legs out from under itself by refusing to subscribe to any view of popular constitutionalism, and hence undermining both trust in the court and perhaps trust in the Constitution. We need civil society institutions. The Supreme Court needs civil society support, but those of us interested in upholding rights, upholding the rule of law, upholding checks and balances, limiting the power of the president to use fear and intimidation to force compliance with his illegal actions. We need strong civil society institutions. And if all the law firms, all the universities, all of the large corporations like Amazon or Meta simply bend the knee to the president, then it's going to be a much more difficult fight we're engaged in. I am very happy that Harvard is also saying game on, that Princeton is also saying game on, that perhaps Columbia is ultimately but belatedly finding its courage as well. Let us hope that it's not the moribund Supreme Court on its own fighting this fight. So that's what I want to speak with you about today. I will start with the idea that the last week has made it abundantly clear. In the past, I've counseled some caution about not using the term constitutional crisis promiscuously, right? Let's have a clear definition. I think the time for caution is past, right? We are clearly witnessing a court that's trying to restrict the administration, and the administration just thumbing its nose at the court, right? The case of Judge Zenas, for instance, demanding updates, and the administration just saying, no, we're not going to do it. The case of Judge Boasberg saying, give me a detailed accounting of why you didn't turn the planes around in the first instance, and the administration just saying, no, right? We're to the point where the administration and the judiciary disagree on their interpretation of the powers of each of the branches and their respective duties to each other. And the administration is demanding a level of deference that really only makes sense in an autocracy. And the courts are saying no, and the administration is saying, well, too bad for you. Go ahead and enforce your own judgments. We'd like to see you do so. It may be. We will have to wait and see. I've been waiting for Donald Trump or the White House to respond to last night's Supreme Court decision. I'm not seeing much of anything. Tell me if I'm missing anything. It may be that there will be greater respect for the Supreme Court, but nevertheless, right, if the Supreme Court is slow and limited in its capacity, we'll talk more about this in a moment, then that's not a sufficient check. So having said all of that, right, what are the elements that really make clear in the last week, but really in the last now almost 3 months, that this is a autocratic regime in formation, that Trump has genuine autocratic aspirations, and that he has peopled his administration with people who are prepared and competent and willing to execute the autocrat's playbook, right? And so the first is just that he's doing it, right? You know, Project 2025, I was reviewing before I started speaking with you today, and it's incredibly predictive, right? It's modeled on Viktor Orban. It also looks at Vladimir Putin. It also looks at Erdogan in Turkey, and it's drawn the lessons. How did these guys get more power, the power to overturn the constitutional constraints on the executive? Let's do that here as well. And by the way, I'm sure that the people who the Heritage Foundation funded to write Project 2025 read works like Levitsky and Zablat's How Democracies Die and took notes, right? Those are books that are supposed to help us preserve democracy, but in, right, telling us what to look out for, they, in a sense, implicitly give instructions to autocrats. So this is prepared, right? And this gets me to my second point, that this administration is far better organized and more sophisticated than was the first Trump administration. It's not internally divided. It is, right, internally unified around supporting Donald Trump's efforts to maximize his power and leverage as president. And please note, right, that many of the laws that contain provisions that Donald Trump and his administration are exploiting to maximize their power were written on the assumption that you would have a president and an administration that believed in fidelity to the law and the Constitution, right? That they gave power to be used at the discretion of people who were loyal to the Constitution. And when those same laws are used by people who are trying to execute an autocratic power play, they create a lot of latitude for the president and his administration to do this. And then third, and perhaps most distressingly, it's not just this administration, which is right, as I say, populated with yes men, but not only with sycophants, with people who are actually selected. Russell Vought would be, I think, the chief example here, to maximize the president's power, to exploit the loopholes, to find the latitude in the law, to allow the president to be essentially unchecked in his exercise of power. And the Republican Party, at least the elected officials, but it appears a fair bit of the rank and file of the Republican Party are going along with this. And that what that means is a substantial portion of America supports this assault on rights, on the rule of law, on the separation of power. So if that's the background, how did this come to be? And here I'm reiterating very quickly points we've talked about together before, that democratic constitutional government is intrinsically fragile, right? The Constitution is a piece of parchment in the National Archives. It only has power and force if our elected officials, if the people in administrative agencies, if the elites in business and other civil society institutions, and ultimately the people of the United States think that it is worthy of respect and defense, right? And so we need a widespread commitment to upholding the values, norms, rules, and institutions that the Constitution specifies. And it appears in 2025, at least through April 19th, that commitment is not apparent, certainly not in officials within the Republican Party, especially within Congress, but also in the willingness of Americans to continue to support Donald Trump despite his obvious abuse of power and autocratic ambition. And so this brings us to the second point, right, which is for reasons good and bad. And I want to underline good, right? A significant portion of Americans have lost faith in the capacity of the system of government outlined by our Constitution to do what they need done, to preserve their core economic security, to maintain their status and dignity. And that while we certainly should criticize Trump and defend the Constitution, we should also recognize that we have failed these people. And what we're seeing in 2025 is a predictable consequence of the failures of democratic government, of constitutional government, of the institutional structure of the United States to deliver the goods, to allow people to afford a decent living in the United States in the 21st century, when 30, 40, 50% of us feel downward mobility, precariousness, loss of the status that we had enjoyed prior to deindustrialization and the information revolution and globalization, then it's not going to be too long before those people begin to ask, well, why exactly should I stand up for this government if this government doesn't stand up for me? Third, right, the autocratic playbook involves attacking both institutions and norms, right? So Trump is attacking, right, the independence of administrative agencies, right? He attacked Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve. He has removed the Democratic members of the Federal Trade Commission. He has removed many of the attorneys general, the overseers of the executive and administrative state. He is, of course, attacking the judiciary, calling for the impeachment of judges. And he is attacking the universities, the law firms, the press, and the woke culture of businesses, right? He's attacking the independence of the states, right? Maine is in the crosshairs right now. He's attacking the independence of schools, right? The local elementary and secondary schools at the state level, various things that the Constitution very clearly says the federal government does not have power over these institutions. Well, they do rely in certain respects on federal funding. And boy, does Donald Trump have a nose for leverage. He looks for it wherever he can find it. If Harvard is getting federal grants to support medical and other forms of scientific research, that is leverage. And I want to be clear as possible, right? The reason the United States has more Nobel scholars in its universities than there are in the rest of the world. The reason that we hold the patents and copyrights that are the backbone of the information economy is because our major research institutions are the envy of the world. You attack them again, you cut the legs out from underneath the competitive advantage the United States has. Donald Trump doesn't care. I really think that at this point we are seeing that what he cares about is power and leverage for him, for his administration. We need to be honest about the moment we're at right now. It's not going to stop where we are, right? It will get worse if we don't stand up and push back. And by the way, right, this is the autocratic playbook. Attack the institutions, attack the norms that preserve the rule of law, that protect and represent diversity and pluralism, that check the abuse of power. And some of those norms and institutions are legal. Many of them are in civil society, and he's going after all of them quickly and thoroughly. This is accomplished through spreading fear and intimidation to demoralize, disorganize, and isolate opposition, right? And again, the autocrat playbook is clear, right? Hope that people will be slow to react. Hope that many will be more focused on their short-term needs. Hope that a substantial portion will actually support you. At least you're doing something. At least you're following through on what you said you would do. And again, some of the polls indicate that the Trump supporters, at least the MAGA supporters, are saying, yeah, this is exactly why we elected this man. This doesn't frighten us. This is why we support him, right? And so I'm going to conclude this little portion by saying, right, I think that that's not the majority. I think even a fair number of the Trump supporters who are not MAGA Republicans are having second thoughts. Some are having buyer's remorse, right? Especially around the tariffs and the economic agenda. But the power of the majority to bring the MAGA Republicans to heel before 2024 2026, really 2027, right? There'll be elections in November 2026, but the new Congress won't take seat until 2027, that this is limited, right? And it's limited by the fact that Congress is controlled by the Republicans, and the Republican Party is Donald Trump's plaything right now. And frankly, it's also limited by the judiciary having been half appointed by Republicans, but also, I think, having a sense of its intrinsic weakness in the 21st century. So a little bit more factual background, and as you can see, I've got um, uh, Kilmar Abrego Garcia's picture on the board here, as well as a picture of the prison that he was apparently transferred out of yesterday, right? But this is where he was held, right? This notorious torture prison, and it now appears, I think, and I have uh, modified my view on this, that the Supreme Court was not as reticent in its original holding, which, right, differentiated between facilitating his return and effectuating his return, upheld the portion of Judge Zenas' holding that ordered the administration to facilitate his return to the United States, but struck down, no, I take it back. We'll get into the details here, but ordered her to clarify what it meant to effectuate in a way that showed adequate respect for and deference to the independent and co-equal power of the executive. We'll get into that. So since that Supreme Court has decision has come down to Judge Zenas, right? Judge Zenas has ordered that the administration take immediate steps to facilitate his release, and the Trump administration has refused to comply. Basically, is hiding behind this distinction, facilitate and effectuate. Michael Dorff at Cornell Law School calls this a laughable reading of what the Supreme Court ordered them to do. It's so bad. It's so strained. It's part of the reason I think the justices, some of whom are in their late 70s and 80s, got up apparently in the middle of the night to stop the administration from doing this again. It's just patently clear at this point that the administration is going to read the directives from the court in such a tendentious way that there's no longer any trust between the court, the federal bench, and this administration. The right Judge Zenas ordered daily updates. The administration said you can't do that either, right? And so we have non-cooperation. We have what I've called an interinstitutional constitutional crisis, in which, right, the Supreme Court and the federal bench is saying this is what the Constitution allows us to do, and the Trump administration is saying either we don't agree or we don't care, and by the way, we're not going to respect or show any deference to the court or the judiciary. And then one of the things I would add is that there is just so much chaos in our politics right now that it's really not clear that there is going to be a real focus of political attention and energy on this, despite the fact that this really is the core structure of our constitutional government buckling under the strain of two of our main branches of government colliding with each other, and the third branch basically sitting it out. I don't know if you can hear my doorbell is ringing. I'm the only person home. I will be right back. Sorry. Sorry. All right. Sorry for the interruption. Um, oops. What happened? Um, can anybody tell me, are you still seeing my slides, I hope? I think so, right?
Yes, we're seeing them now. At first we
Okay,
saw the whole
good.
screen. Now it's
Yeah,
everything.
okay, good. Yeah, it was good.
You're good.
And
Yep.
sorry?
You're good.
Good. Okay. Thank you. And I'll go ahead and get people muted again. Now I'll just note very quickly, right, that in addition to the conflict over Abrego Garcia, and I'll say just a little bit more about this very quickly, right? Abrego Garcia has been accused of being a member of a Venezuelan gang, and that is the pretext for his being deported. And by the way, right, this accusation appears to be highly suspect, right? It comes from a detective who was dismissed for corruption. It comes using an informant who was never confronted and who puts Abrego Garcia in a place he's never been in his life. It does appear that Abrego Garcia, who's been in the country because he was targeted by an El Salvadorian gang in his hometown, who's been here since 2019, since he was, I think, 16 years old, is basically a law-abiding, decent person married to an American citizen with American children, and is working, contributing to our economy. So the idea that he is being deported as a gang member and then unable to confront, right, as the Constitution indicates he has the right to do, the accusation against him, or to have right due process, is why his lawyers call this Kafkaesque, right? This is as one of the people who I've been listening to say, right, not too far off from Chile in 1973, where you can just be pulled off the street, thrown into custody, deported without any opportunity even to see a judge, to talk to your lawyer, to have any kind of due process, right? James Boasberg, right, the Chief Justice in the Federal District Court of Washington, right, is the person who this case went in front of originally and who ordered the planes to be turned around in air, ordered the deportations not to occur. And by the way, it turns out the Supreme Court has said he didn't have jurisdiction. And that is, I think, part of the background to this. We'll get into this, but I think the Supreme Court made a mistake, frankly, in that decision, because what this does is give the administration the incentive to play cat and mouse, to just move, right, the people it's trying to deport around so that by the time the lawyers get to the court, they're no longer in the jurisdiction where the lawyers are presenting their arguments, to move them to places that are more friendly, less likely to allow a ACLU judge to make the case that they shouldn't be deported. That's why the Supreme Court has to get up in the middle of the night to take care of this. But Boasberg, going back to Boasberg, is saying, look, I told you not to do this. You did it. When I told you not to do it, the Supreme Court hadn't ruled. You were under my jurisdiction. I want you to tell me why you didn't do it, and I want a full report of who was involved. And once again, the administration is saying no. We're not going to do it. The president of the United States is calling for him to be impeached, for Boasberg to be impeached again, right? I think it's as clear as it can be. The moment of constitutional crisis has arrived. The moment in which the veil falls off the face of the aspiring autocrat has arrived. So let's look at that Supreme Court decision and the original, right, not the one that was issued last night, which, by the way, was simply an order, not a decision. There's no text associated with it. But in the original Nome v. Abrego Garcia case, in which the Supreme Court said that Judge Zenas was correct to say that the administration had to facilitate Abrego Garcia's release, but could not be ordered to effectuate it until that term had been clarified. The order by the United States District Court for the District of Maryland, sorry for the typo, I think that might actually be in the decision, properly requires the government to, quote, facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador, right? So this is where, the bodies are buried. What does facilitate mean? We're going to get there because another judge has already weighed in on this. But please note, this is still quite right. The Supreme Court saying, and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador, right? And so the Supreme Court is telling the administration, you got to make sure this man's rights are upheld. And the idea, this is why Dorff calls this a laughable misconstrual of this decision to say, well, what facilitate means is we have to provide a plane if El Salvador decides to release him, right? Nothing other than that. We know that the president of the United States and the president of El Salvador met together on Monday, discussed this, and in a chummy way laughed it off, right? We're not doing anything about this. Come on. And so not only that, but in that conversation, they also discussed, Trump urged, right, the president of El Salvador, a notorious strong man populace, to build more prisons to house American citizens. And by the way, that's when we're fully to El Salvador, to Russia, to Hungary, when our own citizens are being whisked away to places where they no longer have the rights under our Constitution, essentially being disappeared from the legal system. And again, I think this is why the court was so fast and so direct in intervening last night. So the intended scope of the term effectuate, to continue to quote from the Supreme Court, in the district court's order is, however, unclear and may exceed the district court's authority. The district court should clarify its directive with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. For its part, the government should be prepared to share what it can concerning the steps it has taken and the prospects of future steps. And this, again, is where things get tangled because, right, Judge Zenas is saying, okay, the Supreme Court said, share what you can, and the administration is saying, can't share anything. Sorry, right? So Judge Zenas has threatened the administration with contempt. The administration has appealed. That appeal went to Judge Harvey Wilkinson, and Wilkinson is a conservative jurist. He's appointed by Ronald Reagan, well respected by the Federalist Society and other conservative judges, but he was having none of it. This is what he said. And I'm going to quote rather extensively from his opinion because I think it's actually extraordinarily important in clarifying the stakes, but also the limit of what the judiciary can do. He says, quote, "It is difficult in some cases to get to the very heart of the matter, but in this case, it's not hard at all. The government is asserting a right to stash away residents of this country in foreign prisons without the semblance of due process that is the foundation of our constitutional order. Further, it claims in essence that because it has rid itself of custody, there is nothing else that can be done." That's the game over claim, right? This should be shocking not only to judges, but to the intuitive sense of liberty that Americans far removed from courthouses hold dear. And I think that's a critical line in this opinion, right? Judge Wilkinson is saying this is not a narrow, esoteric legal question. This is the bedrock of freedom in the United States. The government can't just disappear you. Right? And if we allow the government to do that and then to say, oh, it's over, there's nothing left we can do because we've already done it, then every person should live in fear of the possibility that the government will do this to them. The opinion now dives into what the Supreme Court said and what the appropriate way to interpret it is. The Supreme Court's decision does not allow the government to do essentially nothing. It requires the government to, quote, facilitate Abrego Garcia's release from custody in El Salvador and to ensure that his case is handled as it would have been had he not been improperly sent to El Salvador. Facilitate is an active verb. I think it's a little funny, right? He's giving essentially the Trump administration a grammar lesson, right? It requires that steps be taken, as the Supreme Court has made perfectly clear. Facilitation does not permit the admittedly erroneous deportation of an individual to the one country's prisons that the withholding order forbids, and further to do so in disregard of a court order that the government not so subtly spurns. Facilitation does not sanction the abrogation of habeas corpus through the transfer of custody to foreign facilities. I'm sorry, there's a typo there, or I didn't adequately transfer the full opinion. Why don't I stop there? Because I want it to move into the remainder of Wilkinson's decision. I think you're getting the point, right? That even if there's no duty to effectuate, what the Trump administration is doing is clearly not anything to facilitate, and that's a direct refusal to do not what a court or a judge, but what the Supreme Court of the United States has directed it to do. This is now where I think we get to the Jeremiad portion of Wilkinson's decision, right? This is a lament more than it is a directive at this point. The basic difference between the branches mandates a serious effort at mutual respect. This is amplifying what the Supreme Court has already said. Some deference needs to be shown to the executive. And by the way, the previous 2 pages of this decision really are about the reason for the judiciary to have deference to the executive. He then continues, the respect that courts must accord the executive must be reciprocated by the executive's respect for the courts. Too often today, this has not been the case, as calls for impeachment of judges for decisions the executive disfavors and exhortations to disregard court orders sadly illustrate. Now the branches come too close to grinding irrevocably against one another in a conflict that promises to diminish both, right? So the court is having, the federal bench is having to become increasingly aggressive in its conflict with the president, because the president and the executive branch he heads are disregarding, are ridiculing, are acting in open defiance and with obvious ill intent toward the judiciary. So the idea that this is what a constitutional crisis looks like, where the 2 branches grind against each other, I think is extremely important. This is a losing proposition all around, Wilkinson continues. The judiciary will lose much from the constant intimations of its illegitimacy, to which by dint of custom and attachment we can sparingly reply. And I just want to focus there for a second, right? I think what Judge Wilkinson is saying, in essence, is we, the members of the federal bench and the Supreme Court, are not politicians. We cannot go over the head of the president to the people in order to demand that they pay attention to us. We're not going to organize a rally. We're not going to fly the banner and get people in the streets. We write dispassionate decisions. We reason, we argue, and by the way, most of what we do is incredibly arcane. This is about as passionate as a judicial decision as you will see, right? And it's probably not going to by itself do the trick. So the judiciary will lose. The executive will lose much from a public perception of its lawlessness and of all its attendant contagions, right? And so now we begin to get into the idea, right, that we don't just have a lawless president. We don't just have a president who clearly, in the way they're going after Colombia, in the way they're going after the law firms, in the way they're going after former administration officials, removing their security details and security clearances, opening FBI investigations into them, we have an administration that is not adhering to law. Right, that we just have to recognize that and begin to really work this new environment into our political sensibilities and imagination. We are moving in the direction of Chile, Hungary, Russia, Turkey. We are no longer in a society where the executive has respect for the law. So this will damage the executive, right, as Wilkinson puts it, and it will lead to a contagion of lawlessness. The idea that you may have heard bandied around on October 15th, on April 15th, that it's now voluntary to pay your taxes because, right, the IRS has lost a third of its employees. And so, right, which laws will we obey? Will the Proud Boys be back in the streets if there's something that they don't like, right? This is, I think, the danger that Wilkinson is trying to say, come on, please. You have to recognize that history won't be kind to you. The executive may succeed for a time in weakening the courts, but over time, history will script the tragic gap between what was and all that might have been, and law in time will sign its epitaph, right? This administration will be out of power, and at that point it will be clear that what it did was illegal and lawless, and maybe not Donald Trump, but many of the people in this administration will be held to account for that. This is as close as the judiciary gets to threatening future prosecution. It is, as we have noted, all too possible to see in this case an incipient crisis, but it may present an opportunity as well. We yet cling to the hope that is not naive to believe our good brethren in the executive branch perceive the rule of law as vital to the American ethos. This case presents their unique chance to vindicate that value and to summon the best that is within us while there is still time. Frankly, I don't know who Wilkinson is writing to here. I am sure it's not Donald Trump, right? And so the question is, who else in his administration might read this and say, "Oh, I guess he's right." So let me continue, and I've got a fair bit more to say. I won't go all the way, but I just want to point out that it's not just right. The case of Abrego Garcia, we have Moshe Madawi and Mahmoud Khalil from Colombia in deportation holding, who both have green cards, right? Madawi was one step from being naturalized when he was detained. We have, right, the student from Tufts University who was abducted on the street. I'm sorry, detained on the street, but it certainly looked like an abduction, right? And this is, right, the letter that was written to Sarah Lawrence. This is the letter that was written to Harvard University, right? We have not just this one case, which is now making its way up to the Supreme Court. We have multiple civil society institutions being attacked in order to spread fear, in order to shut down the centers of independence and criticism in our civil society. This leads us to what happened last night, and I'll be brief about this, right? But I think what we see is increasing judicial skepticism, that the Trump administration is acting in good faith, and therefore an increasingly aggressive judiciary trying to rein it in. But I will say, as I've said to you in the past, that this may be difficult for the Supreme Court or the federal judiciary to do on its own, right? This is a court that was substantially remade by Donald Trump with 3 appointments. And frankly, those 3 justices just voted to rein him in, but they also voted to overturn Roe v. Wade, right? And they've voted, or justices in the past, to gut the Voting Rights Act, to open the floodgates for money in our elections, to give an absolute right to gun ownership in ways that have made many Americans, especially school children, feel incredibly unsafe. And so the idea that the court is actually a moribund institution, a not particularly legitimate institution, an institution that has to erect barricades before it makes decisions, indicates that this may not be the bastion, the bulwark of defense that we need for our Constitution. I've pointed out to you in the past that this has been a multi-hundred of millions of dollars campaign, probably $500 million spent to produce this court, right? And yes, the oligarchs like this court and like this jurisprudence, and that's why they were willing to invest in it. But the majority of Americans don't, right? And so the idea that the court that was 2 years ago, a rogue supremacist court, is today going to be greeted as the last defense of liberty, a bastion of the rule of law, I think may be a little difficult to maintain. And that, frankly, Donald Trump has picked his battle well. He is doing his best to convince his base and many other people who don't pay a lot of attention to the news or who live in the Fox News universe that, look, all he's doing is kicking out people who should never have been let into the country by that lawless and feckless President Joe Biden, kicking them out because they are criminal gang members who threaten the native born, right? And he thinks maybe he will actually win the battle of public opinion against the judiciary and show the judiciary to be part of the deep state, part of the liberal, woke problem with the United States. And by the way, right, the court is increasingly perceived to be a partisan institution because its opinions are increasingly partisan. I'm sorry to be going fast. We have talked about this stuff before. We can come back to it, but I want to just point out to you, right, that the American people increasingly view the court unfavorably, that there's a partisan split with Republicans liking the court more than Democrats in the aftermath of these decisions we've been talking about. And by the way, that this is a court by a 6-3 vote that just gave Donald Trump, right, the ability to know that he can act lawlessly, so long as what he does is related to the core functions of the executive. And clearly that is the way in which Donald Trump is framing this. This is an invasion. I'm going to use the Alien Enemies Act, right? This is a financial emergency. I'm going to impose all of these tariffs, right? He and his team recognize that the Supreme Court have basically allowed him to skate free in doing this. And please note, right, that Donald Trump had perhaps the second worst rate of success in court when he was president in his first term, right? There are more than 160 cases and thousands of counts being filed against this administration right now. And so I will say to you, by way of conclusion, and I know I've rushed through this, but I think what history teaches is that courts by themselves are necessary, but certainly not sufficient to preserve the rule of law. What is also required is an organized civil society. Civil society institutions like universities, law firms, press agencies, unions, social movements. And that, as I've tried to say to you before, it is well past time that we start to get organized, right? And please note, right, that I think merely going to big protests by itself is not going to do it. Please note that, right, the law allows the president to use the military when he declares a crisis. The, the president has fired the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, has put a total loyalist in charge of the Defense Department, has fired all of the high-ranking lawyers, the JAGs within the military branches. He seems to be anticipating that there will be big protests. And if there are big protests and only big protests, I do think that we should worry that there will be a militarized response to them. We need more than that. We need a well-organized civil society. We need to get into meetings at the local level on a regular basis. We need organizations like Harvard and the Associated Press, but we need organizations akin to our unions, which have atrophied, which are moribund in 2025. We are not well positioned to backstop the Supreme Court or to stand up for ourselves in this era. And as difficult as it is to have to reckon with this, I do think we are now absolutely devoid of excuses. It is clear that this is what the Trump administration is trying to do, and it is time for us to stand up against it. How's that for a conclusion? Who wants to start us out today with a question or a thought based on the more detailed analysis I gave you of the recent legal cases, or the total sprint I gave you through the idea that we are not going to limit the Trump autocratic grab by courts alone? Who wants to start us out? I see Anne, go ahead. Thank you.
Yeah. There I am. You just asked us a question. My question to you is how? We need to stand up other than our, the protests. But I think that I certainly don't know, and people that I know don't know how, don't know what to do next.
Yeah, and it is a problem, right? Which is when you are in a society that has retreated into privacy, right? Has stopped going into movements and civil society organizations, community-based organizations. Where do you start? But I would suggest to you that you need to pick a cause, right? Let's say it's immigrants' rights. And so then you need to figure out who in your backyard is doing that work, right? Is it a church? Is it a union? Is it a law group? Is it immigrants' rights group? And my guess is that if you spent half an hour either on Google or even better, right, talking to people within your community, you could pretty quickly figure out what some of those organizations are. If you're more interested in climate change or the environment, or you're more interested in academic freedom or the rights of defendants to counsel, right? Again, I think you can find the organizations. But here's what I would say, right? I think you need to also then ask, what are you doing to build capacity in civil society. If all you're doing is asking for money and then hiring lobbyists and fancy academic talking heads to go to congressional hearings, you're not actually generating the capacity we need in 2025. And so you have to choose carefully. And then there's a question, do you give money? Assuming you find an organization that you think is actually doing the work that needs to be done. Do you give your time? Do you go to meetings? Do you say, I'm probably not in a good place to go to a lot of meetings right now, but do you have some phone work you want me to do or some emails you want me to send, right? I do think, and that it is a genuine problem, right, in 2025, that we've lost the culture of social mobilization, of social movements. But we've built that culture before. We can build it again. And by the way, if there's something you're really interested in that you're not finding out there, I think that means you need to reach out to 10 or 20 people that you know and say, look, this is something we need and we don't have. What can we be doing? Right. And hopefully some of those people are younger people, are more energetic. Maybe some of them are students and have a little bit more time on their hands. And by the way, I think we have to be smart and careful in this environment. Right. And so I gave a version of this talk at Sarah Lawrence a week ago. I quoted Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass, who says, obey little, resist much. I quoted Timothy Snyder on Tyranny, who says, don't engage in anticipatory obedience, right? We need to be brave. We need to stand up, but we also need to be smart, right? If you have someone who is a non-citizen, try to keep them out of the spotlight. If you're doing social organizing work, maybe don't put it on social media right away. I don't think I really need to tell you guys this, but find ways of communicating with people who are on the phone, on email, not yet on Facebook, right? And I'll just say very quickly, when we look back at the history of this, we know that the civil rights movement, for instance, did this in the South in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, 60s, right? When, frankly, being caught doing this could lead to extrajudicial murder, lynching, right? And so there is a playbook there. Again, and I do appreciate your question, and I do know I sped through this, but in this slide, I identified, right? Robert Putnam does a very good history of this. Kesabil Rahman and Holly Russell Gilman have really interesting proposals. But then I also have Marshall Gans on the board here, right? Who was one of Cesar Chavez's lieutenants in the organizing of the California farm workers, right? And I have this book, Prisons of the People, and its authors on the board as well. These are books about 21st century grassroots organizing that say, look, we can't just write checks and sign petitions and go to big rallies. That's not going to generate the capacity we need. We need actually to build civil society organizations. David, go ahead.
Sure. Well, we're planning on going out on the street in March at 1 o'clock. Are you suggesting that we should not do that? That it's irrelevant or counterproductive?
No, I'm not suggesting that it's irrelevant or counterproductive. And I am
just ineffective.
Pardon?
Just ineffective.
Let me be a little bit more precise. How about insufficient? Right?
Okay.
Yeah. So by all means, go to a protest, right? And let yourself be seen and create the news, right? This is not the majority view. This is not something that we agree with. As a matter of fact, we disagree with it so strongly that we're coming out here, taking time out of our weekend to engage in protest, right? That's
Yeah,
important.
I think protests are a matter of bearing witness,
Yeah,
and they fill that function. I completely agree with you that the action that's needed now is for our civic society institutions, like unions, like universities, like state and local governments, like organizations, are the place where the action has to take place, and that's pretty much what David Brooks said 2 days ago in his diatribe against the Trump administration and his call for action. I think that's at least how I read it.
yeah, I have to admit, I have been working on a lot these days. I did not have a chance. I liked the headline that I saw from Brooks' article, but I didn't have a chance to read his op-ed yet.
Well, it was pretty much that same thing that it's our civil society institutions that have to step up to the plate now.
Good, good, good company, I guess, on that issue. Anybody else today? Anybody want to go into the legal tall grass and what's happening with the Supreme Court, et cetera? All right. Well, I mean it when I say it's not game over, it's game on, right? I thought about that title kind of carefully, kind of spontaneously actually came out of my mouth in class earlier this week, and one of my students said, "That's really good. You got to use that." And I do think that it's important to recognize, right, that what we're seeing right now is an effort, right? It's not fait accompli on the part of a presidential administration to attack the institutions that limit its authority, its power, and that frankly, these efforts fail. They don't always succeed. And whether or not they fail or succeed depends upon our willingness to resist. And so, by all means, go to the demonstration, but also recognize that probably by itself, that's not enough. And so, we do need the courts, we do need Harvard, but we also need ordinary people in their backyards, in their own communities, organizing as well. Flossie, did you want to say one more thing? You would have to unmute. Still can't hear you, Flossie. You have to hold that space bar down, right?
Nobody has told us that we can't do this. Nobody in administration. And that, I think, is the first test. We're going out on our own, and I think we have our resident council to support us. I won't swear to that, but I think that we're working to represent our community. I have not felt any official resistance, and we have a good number of people who are going to go out. We're going to shout a little bit, but I don't think it's going to be fun this time. I think we are going to face some opposition. We may even gain some support, but I think that conscience tells us that our particular group of oldies has a conscience, and we have to respond to it. So give us your blessing.
You have my blessings, oldies but goodies. And not only that, I will say, be brave, be safe, be smart, right? And I think those things are compatible with each other. And at the same time, they temper each other, right? And so I don't think I need to say this as much to you as I need to say it to my young students. But I do think many of my students have more courage than they have smarts. in the way in which they organize. And they've made it a little too easy. Remember, right, and this I think is a topic for another day, but a large portion of the country does not agree with you, right? And part of the reason, at least, they don't agree with you is for somewhat good reasons, right? They feel that they've been betrayed for the institutions we're standing up for, right? And so we have to not only say we value these institutions, but these institutions can work for you too. And by the way, in their absence, you're going to be in trouble too, right? And so I'm not saying that by itself a rally is a good place to make the subtle case for the value of constitutional checks and balances, rules of law, rights that are judicially enshrined. But having said that, we need to be thinking about how we reach out to the other side and say, come on, we recognize your pain. We want to help. We need to do something, but not this, right? All right, everyone. Wonderful being with you as always. Difficult times. Good luck this afternoon, and I will see you back here next week. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye, guys. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Pleasure as always. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.